If you listen to our song service on the internet, we, although we're small, we have a really good sound that comes from this congregation. And we're grateful for that indeed. Glad to see everybody here this morning. Our number is down this morning, but we want to encourage all that are here this morning and those that might be listening to us, that you might follow carefully with what we have to say, and should there be something that you learn that you need to obey the gospel, we would encourage you to do that. This morning, I'm going to be, my lesson is entitled, Eaten Up with Envy. I don't know if you're like me, those of you that are old enough to remember that probably very early in your life you learned about associating the color green with envy. We talk about being green with envy, or being eaten up with envy, or the green-eyed monster of envy, such things as that. I don't know whether you've ever thought about where words come from and word association, but I looked up as to what this idea of associating green with envy. And one thing I learned from someone, I don't even know who the author was, but said the origin of the idiom green with envy is believed to come directly from the great William Shakespeare himself. In Othello, Ioga warns Othello, "Beware, my lord, of jealousy. It is the green-eyed monster which doth mock the meat it feeds on." Then another person on the internet said that it was of much earlier origin. The idea goes back to the Greeks. The ancient Greeks believed that envy was, or jealousy, was caused by overproduction of bile, giving the complexion a greenish hue. In the 7th century BC, Sappho describes an ex-lover as green, as being green. But then another person corrects that and says Sappho describes herself as being green. And then another person says that she ascribes to herself as being paler than grass. I don't know whether that's really true or not, or whether we can ascribe exactly where it came from. I just know that I remember these things very early in my life, and you probably do as well, being green with envy. But the important thing is not so much where the association between envy and being green came from, but what it means and what it does to us. And I hope to be able to talk about that this morning and to leave no doubt as to what it can do to us. The word itself, the Greek word, is the word phanathos, and it is, according to W.E. Vine, he says that envy is the feeling of displeasure produced by witnessing or hearing about the advantage or prosperity of others. Then he goes on to show a contrast between envy and jealousy, and showing the difference. Jealousy comes from the word zelos in the Greek, and it is sometimes translated as zeal or jealousy, and it is translated envy in the authorized version, and it is to be distinguished from phathanos, and apart from the meanings zeal and indignation. And it is always translated jealousy in the Revised Version. One thing we might mention that this word, that is jealousy, can be used in a positive sense. Paul talks about to the Corinthians. He writes to them in 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, and there he says that I am jealous of you with a godly, or jealous for you with a godly jealousy. So we can have a jealousy for other people in a very positive way. But in this particular case, he notes that the distinction lies between these two, envy and jealousy, that envy desires to deprive another of what he has. Jealousy desires to have the same or the same sort of thing for itself. And I tried to come up with an example. And for instance, let's say somebody got a new automobile. And if I'm jealous, I would say, I'm jealous of your car in that I would like to have a car like you have, a car just like you have. But if I am envious of that car, I would say, I hope you go home and you have a wreck and you total that car. You see the difference? Envy is much more severe, much worse. And I would submit to you this morning that envy is, in fact, destructive. The Bible talks about this quite a bit. In the book of Proverbs, the wise man says in Proverbs 14 and verse 30, a heart at peace gives life to the body, but envy rots the bones. And then in another place, he says in chapter 27, wrath is cruel and anger is outrageous, but who is able to stand before envy? Now, what these two verses, I think, show us very clearly is that envy is very destructive. Matter of fact, if we allow envy to continue in our lives, ultimately it will destroy us and probably many others who are around us as well. And I would also submit to you this morning that envy leads to wrongdoing. There are good examples that we have in regard to that. You remember that it is envy that caused Joseph's brothers to do great harm to him. I think all of us are familiar with the story of Joseph and how that his father actually made a distinction between him and his other 11 brothers. And they didn't like that. And whenever he made that coat of many colors, you remember that? Well, we find in Genesis 37 and verse 4 the result of that as far as the brothers were concerned. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. They could not have a decent conversation. I can just imagine him going out into the field and him perhaps going around some of them, and they would always have some kind of a snide, nasty remark to say to him. And we find also that if you remember that on a couple of different occasions, Joseph had a dream. One of those dreams was about 12 sheaves of grain. And the one sheaf that represented Joseph rose up, and the others bowed down before him. Joseph told them that this represented what would happen to them someday. They would bow down before him. And then we find on another place where he had another dream, and this was about the sun, the moon, and the stars. And all of those entities bowed down before Joseph on that occasion as well, which was represented by another star as well. But you notice after this took place, in chapter 37 and verse 11, it says, his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And of course, we know that after this, what happened was that they were so angry with him and so put out with him, they envied him so much that they threw him in a pit. They sold him to a group of, a band of travelers. They took him to Egypt. He was taken to Egypt. He was wound up in prison there on occasion. But finally, he was exalted to the second in command in all of Egypt. And ultimately, the very thing that he had promised, that he had prophesied that would take place, did take place. And we find in Genesis 42, this many years after the events that we had just been talking about, this is said about his brothers. Then they said to one another, "We are truly guilty concerning our brother. For we saw the anguish of his soul when he pleaded with us, and we would not hear. Therefore, this distress has come upon us." And Reuben answered them, saying, "Did I not speak to you, saying, 'Do not sin against the boy,' and you would not listen?" So here was the end result of that. Also, we find in the 7th chapter of the book of Acts that Stephen, whenever he preached to those Jews on that occasion, he mentioned this very event. And he said, "And the patriarchs became envious, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him." So we can see very clearly that in the particular case of Joseph, that the envy that his brothers had ultimately led to wrongdoing. We also see that envy caused the religious leaders to deliver Jesus up to Pilate. Look at Matthew chapter 27 and verse 18. "Therefore, when you have gathered together," Pilate said to them, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. We also find the same thing stated there by Mark in the 15th chapter and verse 11. It was because of envy that they handed him over to Pilate. But we find also that envy is that which caused King Saul to despise David. Very interesting passage about Saul and David, and all of it is the result of envy. I want you to look carefully at this. On one occasion, if you recall, David had gone out and had defeated the Philistines. And coming back from the victory of that battle, the women came out and met him. And in verse 7 says, "So the women sang as they danced and said, 'Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s.' Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, 'They have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can we have, or can he have, but the kingdom?'" What he's saying here is that David had everything that he really wanted except for the kingdom. And he did not have that as of yet. That was truly envy. He wanted something that David had more than he did. Also, we find at verse 9, he says, "So Saul eyed David from that day forward," reading from the New King James Version. This idea, or this word, or the phrase, "Saul eyed David," understand that in the Strong's Concordance that this is from the Hebrew word alvan, and it means to watch with jealousy, to keep an eye on, to look at with suspicion or jealousy, according to the English Concordance by Kohlenberger. And the Brown Driver Biggs Hebrew lexicon says it means to eye enviously, look askew at. So all of these things show very clearly that Saul was envious of David, and ultimately he wound up losing everything as a result of that. Look at a couple of passages, or the same passage, this passage, from a couple of different translations or versions. "So Saul watched David jealously from that day forward," the Holmes Christian Standard Bible says. "So Saul watched David closely from then on. He was jealous," the New Century Version says. "So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David," the New Living Translation. "So Saul watched David closely from then on. He was jealous of him," the International Children's Bible says. So certainly all of these versions have this idea of jealousy or envy that Saul had. And Saul is a really good example in the Bible of a person's conduct going from bad to worse. And we can see that, and it's all the result of envy. First of all, in this example that we're looking at of Saul, we see the seed of envy. And it starts with the success of another person. And in the cases of Saul, it was with David. Saul was envious of what David had, that is, the accolades of the people. Look at verse 6 again. Now it happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. I mentioned that, read that just a moment ago. So this was what he was envious of. He wanted the accolades that that David was receiving. In chapter 18 and verse 8, it says, Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. But then not only is there the seed of envy, but Saul is a good example of the fruit of envy. It produced evil actions against another person. In verse 10 of 1 Samuel 18, so David played music with his hand as at other times. Now this apparently was something that he did before the king, playing the harp, I would suspect that he's talking about there, playing with a hand, as at other times. But there was a spear in Saul's hand, and Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. Now we're going to see in just a minute where that happened again. Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Now, it's obvious here what envy can do. And the fruits of envy is always against that person that we are envious of, and as well as others, as we will see in just a moment. Saul was so envious that he was willing to kill David. And we're going to see how ridiculous that was in just a moment. So these are the fruits of doing something against the person that we are envious of. 1 Samuel 18 verse 15 says, Therefore when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. Verse 25 says, But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So he couldn't kill him one way, so he tried to do it another, to put him out in the midst of the battle, and hopefully that he would be killed on that occasion. We find in verse 10, he says, Then Saul sought to pin David to the wall. That's the second time that this happened. With a spear, but he slipped away from Saul's presence. And he drove the spear into the wall, so David fled and escaped that night. Verse 11 says, Saul also sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. Now you read these passages and we're going to learn and we're going to see that David did not do a thing that deserved this kind of attitude, but it was the envy on the part of Saul that caused him to want to have him destroyed, that he might look better in the eyes of the people. But then I think there is a good example that we can see of Saul, in that there is always a pit that people find themselves in if they allow envy to continue for a very long period of time. And it hurts those who are close and those who associate with others who are close. Look again at Saul in chapter 20 of 1 Samuel. He says, then Saul's anger was aroused against Jonathan. Jonathan was his son, Saul's son. And he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? Now, he blames his mother, Jonathan's mother, for the feeling that he has about Jonathan, his own son. Do I not know that you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, you shall not be established, nor your kingdom. Now therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die. Now that's what envy does for you. And you notice in all of this example of Saul, it just gets worse and worse and worse. That envy causes him to do things that he would not normally do. Even his own son, he tried to kill and was not going to allow him to be a part of his kingdom, which he had the being a rightful heir of, simply because of his envy of David. And then we see in verse 32, to Jonathan's credit, he said, Jonathan answered Saul, his father, and said to him, why should he be killed? What has he done? Then Saul cast a spear at him to kill him, even to kill his own son, by which Jonathan knew that it was determined by his father to kill David. So Jonathan rose from the table in fierce anger and ate no food that second day of the month, a feast period, I think. For he was grieved for David because his father had threatened him shamefully. Again, we see how down and down and down the actions of people get because of envy. And then we see in 1 Samuel 22 and verse 11, so the king sent to call Ahimelech, the priest, the son of Haddatub, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob, and they all came to the king. And Saul said, hear now, son of Ahitub. He answered, here am I, Lord. Now look at what Saul says. Why have you conspired against me? And you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should arise against me to lie in wait, as it is this day. And Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who among all your servants, now look at that, and who among all of your servants is as faithful as David? Now, pointing out to him, David is your most faithful servant. Why in the world would you have this attitude toward him? And who among all your servants is faithful to David? Who is the king's son-in-law, who goes at your bidding and is honorable in your house? So obviously, whatever he felt about David was not David's fault. It was all his fault, the envy that he had. And then look at verse 15. Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me, let not the king impute anything to his servant. That is, let him not impute it to me, or to any in the house of my father. For your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much. And the king said, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. Just because he suspected this, he was going to put him to death. And he did put him to death. Then the king said to the guards who stood about him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me. But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord, to their credit. And the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priest. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priest and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. Now that's what envy will do for a person and to a person. And then finally, there, insofar as the example of Saul, he is a good indication of the rot of envy. You remember a while ago we read from the Proverbs, it is rottenness to the soul, envy is. It ends with the loss of everything that is important to that person who is envious. And Saul was still more afraid of David, so Saul became David's enemy continually. And then we find in 1 Samuel 28, we learned there that Saul had put the mediums and the spiritists out of the land. We talked about this some time ago in one of our lessons. And then in verse 7 it says, then Saul said to his servants, find me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. That which he knew was wrong, that which he had removed from the land, and now he is going back and violating that which God would have them to do. Look at verse 30, chapter 31 and verse 4 of 1 Samuel. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. Now, this was the occasion that came after all of these things that were going on in Saul's life. He was defeated in battle. He was wounded. Requested his armor bearer to kill him, and he would not, and so he fell on his own sword. So we see that progression, down, 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 down. That's what happens when people continue to follow after and follow in the way of envy and being envious and not getting it under control. I think it's a great lesson for us that we need to adhere to as well. So let's look at just real quickly, why am I envious of others? Well, there are probably a lot of reasons, but let me mention. Do I have feelings of inadequacy? I think we find that sometimes that is the case. Whenever envy, and all of us, I'm sure, have been envious from time to time in our life. We shouldn't kid ourselves. But certainly not to the extent that we've been reading about this morning. And sometimes it is because of feelings of inadequacy. Am I constantly comparing myself with others? Sometimes we do that. The Bible talks about that. Usually, whenever we compare ourselves with another, we compare ourselves with a person who is, what in our own mind at least, is lesser, a lesser person than we are. It makes us look good, at least in our own eyes. And then sometimes I'm never content with what God has given me. I'm always wanting something else. And that can cause a person to be envious. And then am I always unwilling to rejoice with those who rejoice? You know, I think that it is easier to be sorrowful with a person who experiences difficulty in their lives. When a brother or sister is having a rough patch in their lives, it's easy to associate with that and to feel bad for them. But the hard thing sometimes is whenever a person is doing well and they're accomplishing things and there are good things that come about in their life. Can we be able to rejoice with that person as we ought to? The Bible says that we should rejoice with them who rejoice and weep with those who weep. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 12th chapter, verse 26 says, And if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. Or if one member is honored, all the members rejoice with it. That's generally the harder thing to do. But again, let's just briefly look at some things that can creep into the Lord's church in regard to envy. Someone is allowed a preaching role, and I'm not. We can become, or preachers can become envious of things like that. Elders, same problem. People can become envious because that person was chosen to be an elder and I'm just as qualified as they are. We've never had that problem here, I don't think, and I certainly don't think we should. But sometimes that happens in some congregations. Someone is mentioned by name in a prayer and I'm not. That's pretty petty. But I've known of situations just exactly like that. People get their feelings hurt when they're not mentioned when they should be. I'm real careful about that. When I mention different people whenever they do different things, and I think the other members are that way as well. We don't want to offend anybody. We don't want to hurt their feelings. Some people can get their feelings hurt, and it is usually because of envy. Someone is close with certain members, and I'm not. That's one of the things that you really have to be careful in the Lord's church. Cliques. I don't think we have that here, but in some churches you do see that, where there's this one group of people that seem to isolate themselves and no one else can get into that type of a situation. And it can create envy in some members. And someone is given special attention, but I'm not. Again, there's that, we become envious because that person has been given that special attention. So we could go on and say a number of things in regard to it. Sometimes we're envious of our song leaders. I certainly don't know who should be envious of them. Well, they should be jealous of them because they do such a good job, but jealous for them, not of them. And we should want to have the same kind of talents that they do. And we can mention other things as well along that line. But envy ultimately leads to wrongdoing, and we've talked about that earlier in the lesson, I think, very clearly. We've seen that in the examples of Joseph and the example of Saul. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Philippians, he said there, some indeed preach Christ, even from envy and strife, and some also from goodwill. The former preach Christ from selfish ambition, not sincerity. So even during the time of the Apostle Paul, people were preaching for the wrong reason, and he points this out. And it's because of envy and strife. Envy is a work of the flesh, and we need to understand that. It is a work of the flesh. In Galatians, the 5th chapter, and at verse 21, it mentions envy, murder, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you before, such as I also told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Now, envy will not only ruin your life and my life, but it'll also cause us to be lost eternally. So it's an important subject for us to contemplate. And we need to recognize envy for what it is and what it does. The Apostle Paul in Galatians 5 and verse 26 said, let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. So as we close our lesson this morning, my admonition to you and to me and to everyone else that is in the sound of my voice, put away envy before it eats you up. As I said before, I don't think that we have anybody in the assembly this morning in this congregation that and what I'm doing here, that would fall into this category that we've been talking about this morning. But if there is, you don't have to continue in that situation. But rather you can ask God to forgive you for it and begin to work on it. And God says that he'll be faithful to forgive you if we ask for forgiveness and or for any other sin as far as that goes. If you're subject to heaven's call, whether you're out of duty as a faithful, not being a faithful child of God, or if you need to become a Christian through faith in Jesus as the Christ, the Son of God, being willing to repent of your sins and confess Jesus as Lord before men, and be baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of those sins. If you need to do that, or anything in your condition that you need to make known to the congregation this morning, we'd be glad to help you. Won't you come down?